Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our latest in the GA Coach webinar series. Thanks to everyone for being here. It's great to have a good crowd, even though we are back on pitches in so many places. Tonight's topic is called The Next Dance, Psychosocial Aspects of Returning to Play. The presenter is Dr. Kearney. Ciaran is an independent applied psychologist who specializes in performance improvement, accountability, team culture, and mental health. For several years, he has lectured part-time at both St Mary's University College in Belfast and Ulster University, and he's currently program coordinator with Gaelfast in Antrim. He's also, if that wasn't enough, he's completing the final stage of his supervision to become a chartered psychologist in sport and exercise science. Of special relevance tonight's webinar, Ciaran has substantial experience in providing sports psychology support in Gaelic football and hurling at club, college and county level. He has helped Tyrone champions Trillick, Down champions Kilcoo, and title-winning hurling teams in Rossa and Dunloy, both in Antrim. At inter-county level, he has provided support to Derry from 2013 to 15, Monaghan in 2018, and since 2019 has been with Down senior footballers. He also provides psychological support to St Mary's University College Belfast, who won the Sigerson Cup in 2017 for the first time in 28 years, beating favourites UCD. In tonight's session, we're going to really speak about how, as preparations gather pace for return to sport, that an important transition lies ahead. This webinar will explore the psychosocial elements of return to sport for players, athletes, coaches and teams. While primarily aimed at coaches, the insights and information shared will be of great interest to anyone involved in Gaelic games. So it promises to be a really outstanding presentation from Ciaran. And at the end, as usual, we'll probably have some time for questions. So for those of you who have a question for Ciaran as they come up during the session, if you want to just pop them into the Q&A box. So for those of you who maybe haven't been here before, the Q&A box is on your screen. It's a little speech bubble with a question mark in it. So if you click that button and you get to type in the question, those questions will come to me, and I'll be able to pose those to Ciaran later on this evening after the presentation part of the session. So Ciaran, it's over to you.
Cormagat, Peter, good evening everyone. And I think I'll start by Peter's given me a lengthy introduction there. I suppose I'll try starting here by putting a question to you this evening. Have a look at this quote, which is widely distributed on the internet. It's attributed to Michael Jordan. Ask yourself, is that true or false? It's false. If you've been watching The Last Dance or followed the career of Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls and their coach, Phil Jackson, who's in the picture here with Michael Jordan, you'll know that actually that quote is a summary of a dialogue between a coach in the Chicago Bulls and Michael Jordan. The coach said, "There is no I in team." Jordan replied, "But there's an I in win." And so I think really it's a good place to start, because a lot of quotes, memes, clips from YouTube are quoted sometimes in coaching. Not all of them are accurate. And I put my own words in Michael Jordan's mouth there. I suppose for coaches, the journey, the challenge is to be well-informed, be original. And in Jordan's own way, I can imagine him saying, "Coach me, don't misquote me." But I also think it's interesting, the picture, because it reveals a lot about body language as well, and the ability of a coach to listen, and listen even to words that he or she doesn't want to hear, is a great skill, one that I think is going to be especially important in this time ahead of us all. So I want to stay on this topic just for a moment, and I want to put a little thought experiment to you. I'd like you to take part. So it said there's no I in team. Have a look. There's the word team. Let's change the shape of it. Can you see an I? How about this? If we look closer, is it any clearer now? Sometimes you see I think coaching and being involved in team play in Gaelic games involves inspection and closer. And the question or the point I would make is that within a team, I can hide. And there are variations of that on the internet as well, but that's my own particular emphasis. And I hope tonight that it can actually show not only can I hide, but sometimes I can get lost in the team. And I think in this period that we've been through and we're still going through, some people can hide, others can get lost. And as a coach or as coaches and team members, our job is to find everyone and link them together. The I and the team are interdependent. That's my philosophy and perspective on it. Another question for you. Do we coach the game and coach the player? Or do we coach the player and then coach the game? Well, these are questions you may ask yourself as a coach. But for me, we start by knowing your own strengths as a coach, as a player, an athlete, or someone involved in teams, and knowing your own purpose and values. And I know other speakers in this series have spoken about that. I know Eamon O'Shea spoke at length about it. I watched his webinar very closely. I followed very closely some of the other webinars I'll mention in a moment, but I know Pat Culhane was also speaking on a webinar last night and talked about this at length. And I think if you can know your strengths, know your purpose, and know your values, then reach the person, build a connection. When you find the I in team, then you're able to coach, and not before it. So I want to come on to this theme of the next dance, and you've already seen that actually it's a play on the series that we've been watching. Some of us, maybe all of you, I've certainly followed it very closely. And I'm just going to look at tonight one or two examples from that might be relevant, touch upon this theme of what do we mean when we're looking at transition, the transition that we're in Gaelic games. So what do we mean, first of all, by psychosocial? Well, let me deal with the psychological side first of all. In the book I co-authored with the late, great Aidan Moran and Johnny Kramer, last year we published it, and we summed it up as sports people, sports psychology is any mental activity that relates to performance and performance enhancement. I see and have seen through the experience I've gained over the number of years, increasing interest in psychology. Aaron Kearney, who was an Armagh player for many years, made the point himself that he thinks that there's a place for psychologists within GAA teams. He said there's a huge gap between a player's assumptions and their manager's actual thinking. Listening to someone who's withdrawn from the inner circle can allow you to see things from a different perspective. And we're going to come on to that issue, that theme of perspective, on a number of occasions tonight. And current member of the Dublin team, Kevin McManaman, member of the historic 5 All-Ireland winning team last year, said that with sports psychology, he actually developed himself and sustained and, as he put it, saved his own career in football. Without which then he may not have been part of that phenomenal achievement last year by Dublin senior footballers. So I think we're seeing an increasing interest and an increasing application. But I also think it's incumbent on me to explain what it is not, because I still encounter misconceptions and misunderstandings about this topic within sports of various kinds, especially Gaelic games. Firstly, it's not counselling, although it may entail counselling or therapeutic skills, and I myself am trained in that. It's not motivational speaking, which is a common misconception. Although, for me, I think it's very important that a manager, a coach, is able to help players and teams to find their own motivation. But my role would be exploring, helping to explain and enhance individual and team motivation. And I think in this period of time, that has been particularly challenged because of the crisis in terms of health in our society today. And I'd be very clear about this. Sports psychology or psychology in sport is not gimmicks or stunts. It's not pulling a rabbit out of a hat or waving a magic wand. And it's not somebody asking you to do things that you're not content or happy doing. That's very, very much against the philosophy and ethics that I would hold to. And most importantly, maybe for all of you, it's not apart from coaching. Somebody involved in psychology, as I am, is not there to replace you, or should not be, nor should they be trying to make themselves someone on whom you depend. Really, this should be a part of coaching. And the good coaches I know have good psychological skills, just like the good teachers, good parents, good nurses and doctors. So I think it's just a message I'd like to get across tonight. This is not something that's an afterthought for injured players. It's not something that, as I heard somebody a few weeks ago describe, the last couple of inches. It's not that at all. In my view, it's actually an integral part of team building, of player development. It's kernel to a successful team culture. And my experience of it has been very rewarding, both in applied practice and I should also say applied research, where we can get to explore motivation, competitive anxiety, individual differences and motor skills, motor learning, aggression, to do and to explore, to test and validate psychological skills training, to look at social cognition, team dynamics or culture, and leadership and resilience, which we hear a lot about these days. I'll not have time to talk about that or explore it this evening, but it's certainly something in which I have a great interest, and I'm concerned as we go forward that we have a shared understanding about what resilience is and what it isn't, and psychology can help with that. And the social goes with all of this, the psychosocial. For me, putting the social into psychosocial is really ensuring that we have the right connections, as I'll explain in a moment. Theory-free science for me would be like a glass-free drink. And I hope on this very hot evening, with the prospect of maybe pubs opening in the weeks ahead, that's an attractive prospect to you. I'm thirsty myself just thinking about it. But to get back to because I'm teasing you a little bit, I have to explain what the theory behind this is. And the psychosocial approach is to do with the intersection and interaction between social, cultural, and environmental influences on the mind and behavior. And for me, one of the best influences or examples of that is Bronfenbrenner, who, if you don't mind me saying, it also sounds like a cold beer. But it's not. It's a well-developed theory of human development, which is summed up as ecological systems, looking at human development within a complex dynamic ecological system, considering how people develop and how factors impact, coexist, coincide, and contradict each other. And it's not sequential. These things can happen all at once, as actually is happening around us right now. And I spoke about this a little bit at the National Games Development Conference in January this year. To my mind, what has happened since then reinforces the relevance of this approach to understanding how we develop people in order to be able to develop players. And some of you have shared this, some coaches use this as a guide. Can you spot the difference between the original model and the slide beside it? The difference I would point out on the grey circle there is from a perspective on the development of talent, athlete development within Danish professional football. So it's slightly different, maybe a very different context to Gaelic Games, but I do think it's a good thing that coaches consider models from elsewhere and draw upon them. One thing that I think is missing, and it's a very important element of this, and which in the course of my PhD study, which I published 2 years ago, I looked at more closely, is the temporal or time dimension to this. You'll see it's called, in Bronfenbrenner's model, chronosystem. It changes over time. And so I came to try to adapt this. And I'll go through this quite quickly, but I think it might help to frame what we talk about next, and maybe give you a framework within which to explore your own challenges and opportunities as we go through this transition in the GAA. The first, and at the centre, as we talked about at the very start, the I in team is the self, the person who coaches, plays, officiates, and takes parts in our game. And this could be a person of any age. The second is the social. That's the linkages between people. That, in our terms, would be what we consider to be team and others, support staff and others, maybe within the club. And that is then linked to a situation. The situational level of this system can include the opposition, maybe venue, national governing bodies, rules, policies, and culture of the wider organisation. And in reality, we see a lot of that impacting on the social and the self at the moment, with the necessary ban that there was on GA activities and the changes which are now coming about because of the changes within wider society. And it is that wider society that I think we see as impinging on our lives, on our association, and on our sport, not just in Ireland, but across the world. That there are economic, cultural, legal, civic, medical, and governmental factors that impinge, and have impinged unexpectedly and in a very potentially adverse way. But certainly I think in Ireland we can see how all of those systems or levels of the ecosystem, when they act in unison, that it can be for the betterment of every single person. And in truth, every single one of us has also helped to contribute to that too. And the last level, which I've just mentioned, is changes over time. Who could have foreseen that on the 25th of June, 2020, we would be sitting having a discussion like this online? Who could have foreseen the changes in terms of coaching and games, changes for clubs and counties, and the changes that players and all of you as coaches have been experiencing over the last 3-4 months? Every single one of us has an experience of that. And I think that that testifies to the fact that over time, these changes and how these levels of the system interact can be quite formidable. But one more thing I'd like to get across: it's not two-dimensional. You see it on your TV or computer screen tonight as though it's two-dimensional. In truth, it's not. From last year to this year, it is something where there has been a dynamical interaction between many factors within our society and very, very close to us because of this pandemic, the health crisis and health emergency around us. And what happens to one person can affect many. It can affect a community. It can affect a wider society. And likewise, what happens within society can affect every one of us. So how can this framework or template or theory, how can this help us, this model help us understand and make sense of the events which have happened? But let me try to illustrate how I think it can help. Let's go back to the self, the person. In this case, Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan, as a young man, became very involved in basketball and later it became very successful, but it wasn't his only sport. He played American football and he played baseball, and he was actually dropped from his college team, and his mother, rather than chastising or getting on the phone to the coach, challenging the coach for why he had been dropped, she, in his family, they encouraged him to work harder at what he had to do. And later, as you've seen maybe in the documentary, he stepped away from a very successful career in professional basketball, playing for the Chicago Bulls. And he went to play baseball, something which he had not played since his childhood. And there's some debate in the documentary, and there's been debate in the time since about why he chose to do that. But the reality was it was his choice. And he said in the series The Last Dance, that the last conversation he had with his father was about baseball and following in his father's footsteps. His father had been a successful baseball player. And as he approached the finals of basketball, when he returned to the Chicago Bulls, and they were on a very successful run against the Seattle Sonics, they finally won, accomplished the victory in Game 6. Michael Jordan collapsed in the changing room, crying, holding the basketball, rolling around. And he said in the documentary, I had a lot of other things on my mind at that time. And I think good coaches and good teammates have a part to play in this, not only someone like me who does psychology. And Phil Jackson, in his book, Sacred Hoops, actually explained part of what was going on that day of the game. He said we'd come back to Chicago to finish off the game against the Sonics and win the championship in the 6th game. It was on Father's Day. They had their morning shootout, and those of you who know, preparing for games, it's going to involve a meet-up that day. He said, I told the players to participate in Father's Day, enjoy their kids and honour their fathers, but to remember that we want to win the series that night. And it's very important to emphasise this. Michael Jordan's father was murdered, as you may have noticed from the series itself. And it contributed to his decision to step away from basketball and into baseball in his father's footsteps. And when he returned to basketball and played in that final, his father's memory and Father's Day, of course, as a matter of sentiment, was very much to the fore of his mind. As he said himself, I had a lot on my mind. And I think this helps to illustrate how life experiences, which each of us may have, and each of the players with whom you're coaching or working, even you as a coach, those life experiences can influence the outlook that we have and the choices we make. And we have to understand, I think, and look a bit more closely at how circumstances and experience influence us and the choices we make. We have been living through a changed and changing context with what we perceive as risk and very definitely uncertainty. In the picture to the side of your screen is Niall Murphy, who is the chairperson of Club Interma and a very well-known human rights lawyer in Belfast. And Niall Murphy, got very seriously ill, was taken into intensive care, remained there for between 14 and 16 days, and is now been discharged and is in recovery from coronavirus. And I think it helps to illustrate that this is not something that was far away from us. Every one of us may know someone who's been affected by this. Some of you may even have lost someone in the course of this. And I think it's important just to draw on what Dr. Tony Holohan has said in the last couple of days, that in the last 14 days, over a third of the new confirmed cases are young people under 35 years of age. This disease does not solely affect older people. No one's immune, and everyone's responsible for limiting the spread of it. So the risk that we're looking at, we've been living with, and which is ahead of us as we make this transition, is real. In other sports, Novak Djokovic, as you may know, held a tennis exhibition match or event to which he invited players, 4 of whom, or 2 coaches and 2 players, then were tested positive for coronavirus. And in the last day or 2, he himself and his wife have also tested positive for it. And he has said since, I'm very sorry for each individual case of infection, and I hope it won't complicate anyone's life. That's part of the difficulty with this, that although risk, as is measured, could relate to just the risk of death, it can also relate to complications in health. And so Jurgen Klopp observed, as the manager of Liverpool, and they're not far away from completing their own season, he said that he has been more worried about people dying, both in Britain and in Germany, not the football title. And I think it reveals a bit more about perspective, how people have begun to consider where sport fits into life. You can see Jurgen Klopp wearing a face covering, and he actually said in that interview that when he goes to the shops and the petrol station, he wears a face covering and gloves, and he said he finds himself almost the only one doing it. He feels, as he said, almost like an alien, and compares Germany with England or Britain and says they're almost like two different planets. Now, this I mention to you because it illustrates the influence that each of us have and the fact that the ecosystem within which we live and hope to play, that ecosystem is something which is constantly evolving. We would do well to pay attention to that and what's going on around the world as well. Because among us are people who are both health practitioners, like Caroline O'Hanlon of Armagh and Jack McCaffrey of Dublin, and both on the front line, and Gaelic footballers in their own right. And I think this illustrates that, you know, they could be wearing, and this is my wife, so my family's affected too, like maybe many of yours. I've come across coaches and players who have family members working in care homes, which have been badly affected by this. And I'll relate a personal story in a moment, but I think for our players, they could be wearing their football kit on a Thursday night and be going into work to put on their scrubs and their fit mask, goggles and gloves and gown with what's called PPE on a Friday morning. And being aware of that as a coach, I think, is very important in this period of time. That's how I think we can provide the best support. And today, Professor Paddy Mallon said something that I think was important to share with you tonight. This is still a national public health emergency, and our citizens are at no less risk of severe illness and death if they contract COVID-19 infection now than they were back in March. So, as we go forward, the seasonal, the societal, the situational, and the social do impact on the self. And I'll share this example. And I think this brings home just how, and all of you may have stories like this. But at breakfast one morning, my wife and I were talking just before I dropped her down to work very early at the nearby hospital. And she mentioned that putting our young son to bed the night before, she asked him, "Would you mind walking the dog tomorrow?" He said, "Only if you take care at work." That means as part of the conversations. This experience is not something that we can shut outside our door. And if you're coaching young people, children and young people, to be aware of the fact that there may be questions which children ask or remarks which they make, which reflect on their experience of this period of time. And being aware of that and being able to support them, connect with their family and understand what they've been through, I think is part of being an effective coach. The last part to mention on this is that research is beginning to show the level of response, what I consider to be a normal response to a very, very abnormal situation. Research being undertaken by Queen's University on COVID well-being study at the moment has indicated 33% of respondents in the north of Ireland have reported symptoms indicative of generalised anxiety disorder, and that would be higher than would be normally expected. Maybe 1 in 4 of society would normally experience some level of anxiety. So it's now 1 in 3. And that's also reflected by a study just published last week by the Office of National Statistics in Britain, where they said 39% of people married or in civil partnerships reported high levels of anxiety, compared with 19% pre-pandemic. Nearly twice then the level of anxiety. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that this is necessarily an indication of mental illness, but it is certainly something for us to be aware of within the GAA, as I'll come on to talk about later. And I think it reflects itself perhaps in the survey from the GPA, also published in the last few days, in which they indicated 17% of players don't want to return to play during 2020. The difficulty for us, as Professor Simon Wesley and his colleagues at King's College London have found, just commented on within the last 3 or 4 days. This is the wicked nature of a pandemic. It creates an intense anxiety, but the measures we need to control a pandemic, which centre on suppression of our ability to socially interact, actually make it more difficult to manage that anxiety. So there are people living with it. And that's what I want you to please understand and reflect upon. People with whom you may have contact may have been through experiences like this in this period of time and may still be experiencing this. And the ways that we've been trying to address setbacks and losses include accepting and adjusting. Many of you may be like tonight, using Zoom calls or Microsoft Teams online interaction as a substitute for the changing room or the classroom. Differences in quality and the nature of contact are unavoidable, but I think we have to be attentive to it. Here's a picture of my son on his last day at school, finished last Friday. He could not join his classmates. And there's many children whom you may be coaching in this period of time who've experienced similar things at both primary school or bond school and secondary school. And I think being aware of that, I also think that it's worth us indicating, in my experience and research that I've done myself some years ago, there is a qualitative difference between face-to-face interaction, and whether that's on a one-to-one or a group basis, and interaction like this. So be mindful of that. And I think it means that we have further adjustments to make as we go back and transition to the next stage. I think also players, as I've mentioned, people may have changed their life priorities during this period. I've spoken with players. One player last week mentioned that he has been able to see the importance of his family more and more, and that takes priority for him now. Perspectives may have changed about sport, and there may also be people who are worried about where sport, work, and family fit together. But I also think that there are silver linings, and I think if you look a bit more closely, you'll find them. You may have experienced them yourself. There are individuals who have learned lessons from lockdown, and some may have taken great gains. I was speaking with a psychologist who's supporting a Premier League team, and he mentioned, this was a webinar I was involved in last week, but he mentioned that one of the players involved during the lockdown there has been able to go out and enjoy cycling. They've joined a cycling club and they want to stay part of that. That now will be part of their life. And I think that's a wonderful thing, that people actually get to explore another part of sport, or maybe something else, another skill that they haven't had the chance to develop more fully. And being able to support players or people in doing that in this period of time, I think is also an important part of making this transition, that we're not asking people to cut off or shut down things in which they have developed or cultivated a renewed interest. So how can all of this prepare us maybe for what's next? Well, I want to look at the coach, Phil Jackson, begin there again, because in the series, the documentary to which I've referred a number of times, we didn't really get a clear insight into the thinking and the approach of Phil Jackson. He was the one who gave the theme, The Last Dance, to their last season together. There was significant turmoil and conflict within that team. The manager wanted to break the team up and wanted to sack or have Phil Jackson resign. Essentially, that they would not go forward another season. And eventually, at the end of the dialogue and discussion or negotiations, it was agreed Phil Jackson would stay on. And he developed the theme, as he did every season. He framed the season as the last dance. And he, in his coaching career, had a creative way of engaging players, of painting a picture for them. And that might be an idea in this time ahead? What picture is it that you want to paint? What picture is it that your players, your teams would like to paint of being involved in Gaelic games again, of returning after the period of lockdown in which we've been, returning to our pitches? What picture does that represent for them? And you know, in his book, which I have a well-read copy of pictured on the slide, Phil Jackson said, among other things, I learned to trust the moment, to immerse myself in action as mindfully as possible so that I could react to whatever was taking place. And I think that presence of mind is going to be essentially a very important part of this transition as well, as it always is, in my view, for effective coaching. But I would also share in his book, he talks about how he would have visualized his coaching approach. He would have visualized games ahead of time, spent 40 to 45 minutes doing it. So that book, Sacred Hoops, is full of bright ideas that really didn't come through in the documentary. If you're interested in the philosophy and the practice of a very, very successful, very effective and humane coach. Now, I move swiftly to this because I think it's important to look at a framework. And this framework is informed by and adapted from what the English Institute of Sport has just published. And it's borrowed as well from what the Health Service, the NHS, has developed based on understandings of moving through a period of crisis like this. And so it describes a number of stages, which I highlight here, and you'll be able to look in a bit more detail whenever you get the slides or after this session tonight. The first phase is the anticipation phase, and that was probably some time ago for us, where there's an anticipatory anxiety, where the needs might involve acknowledging and expressing that and organising and preparing for what's ahead. And the psychological support role is promotive. The next phase described in this is the impact. And the word in the documents that I've read actually refers to the heroic stage or the honeymoon stage. And we've heard that language used. I know friends and family, not only is my wife a specialist nurse who's been on the front line of this, but my brother has been involved in the ambulance service. And the language of heroism sat uneasily with many people who were involved in the health service. But nonetheless, that's how this stage might be described. And adapting and coping with stress and also having available psychological first aid skills, that was also an important part of that phase. And psychological support was preventive, to try to prevent people slipping too deep, falling off the edge. The response phase, or the core phase, might have involved disillusionment, where people feel a bit more demotivated. I've talked with many players and even some coaches who feel that their motivation has changed over a period of time. And, you know, that can involve acknowledging and adjusting to losses and setbacks, as I spoke about a moment ago. And the psychological support role is sustaining people, trying to ensure that they get support, but also that they learn to sustain themselves. And the last point is this end phase, the post-response period, which is called a restorative stage. And it involves restorative approaches in psychological support, but it also includes needs, which are described as accessing, affirming, and reconnecting. And I want to touch on those just very briefly for you. So accessing, that we should provide an opt-in. And that's one of the most important points in this series of slides I would like to get across. There's a difference between allowing and enabling an opt-in and determining an opt-out. An opt-in is something where an individual team or players can come at any stage and say, I'm ready now to be involved again. But opting out is almost assuming that everybody must conform, everyone must move at the same pace. And I think we've seen an example of that, of finger pointing going on in America, where Rory McIlroy castigated others for not travelling over, saying he couldn't understand why those, if they cared about their careers, why they would not take part in the competitions in America. And we've also seen something a bit more ugly than that in Australia, where a young Gaelic footballer out there playing Australian football, Conor McKenna, has been chastised and almost victimised, I think, because of tests which turned out to be false tests of COVID-19. So it's very important in this, in enabling people to access the games, that we also ensure that expectations are clear, that we understand what they are, we share them, and that everybody knows what their rules are in this particular context. Secondly, affirming involves self-care and safety and support as an absolute priority. This isn't something where safety and support now disappears. It's actually all the more needed in this transition phase, I would argue. And I think it's very important to be clear what behaviours are expected. So how are you going to do that within your team, around your club? Have you thought about that and talked it out with other coaches? And also that the readiness to return is not something where someone was not ready and is now ready. It's not linear or sequential. Someone may be affected in their family life in the next short period of time and may have to change, opt out again before opting in. These are difficult issues, but I think very well worth reflecting on and exploring in closer detail as we go through this transition. And the last one is reconnecting, that we have an opportunity to reconnect with those with whom we share the experience of Gaelic games, those within our club, within our team, and also that communication now is at a premium. Feedback and listening. I heard Eamon O'Shea talk about listening and the importance of it, and observation. I think you listen both with your ears and your eyes. And your observational skills and your listening skills are going to be tested to the limit, I think, in this period of time. And it's something on which people can share ideas maybe beyond this, the best approach and the skills that you can develop in yourself as a coach. And I also think regularly debriefing about this period of time. And I don't mean psychological debriefing, that's a different skill altogether, but as a team, talking about and checking in with people and individually, knowing how people are getting along, not assuming anything about how they feel, what they think, and what they're doing within the team or the club. Now, one difficulty I have with this model, and I know I'm presenting this to you as something that's a framework, but I think it's worth also saying this assumes that there's a linear transition from one phase to another, all the way through to long-term return to normal. The forgiveness I would make for the people who've been excellent researchers who are offering these ideas is very few of us have ever been through a pandemic, and I have never. And I don't know that I have been able to find, I've found some research, which I'll share with you maybe in the Q&A, about what we do in terms of psychological readiness. There's a lot of literature on injury and recovery from injury, but there's literature on recovery from disaster. There's a lot of research on recovery from trauma, but it's difficult to find research on returning to sport after a pandemic. So I think for all of us, this is a challenging time. And I would emphasize, it need not be, and in my view, is not a linear experience. Remember the helix or the Swiss roll. We, I think, could end up with these phases swapping around a bit. And I hope that's not the case, but I'm very mindful of what Professor said in Leinster House in the Oireachtas today, that in actual fact, Professor Paddy Mallon was warning, this crisis is still with us. We need to be vigilant as we step forward and support each other in that process. So look, the last couple of bits I want to share with you are things that you might consider, questions to take away from tonight. Consider your own context. What's controllable? There may be at the level of yourself, the group that you're with, the situation you find yourself in, the team or the club, factors over which you have greater control. Even within society, you may have factors that you can contribute to, you can control. If I go to the shops now or the bank, I will wear a face mask, and that's to protect other people, to avoid me potentially transmitting COVID-19 to other people, because as we know, 40 to 45% of people are asymptomatic with this virus. So we can control our choices, our behavior. We can also control our own thoughts and feelings. We can manage those better. What can you influence? Well, you can influence people around you. Think about it. Think about who and what you can influence within your own context. And finally, what's uncontrollable? I've obviously hinted at or highlighted a number of factors which may be uncontrollable, and some of them may be very close to home. If you have to, then you may be taking care of somebody who is shielding still, who's vulnerable to this virus, and that's a circumstance which you have to adapt to. I have a family member, my mother-in-law, and we have to take care of her in the same way. So please, from a sporting point of view, consider what's controllable, what you can influence, and what's uncontrollable. And for the most part, devote your attention and energy to those things which you think you can control and those things which you feel you can influence. And I think this is even a matter which is useful at times to talk out within teams. The last part of this is to just highlight, in truth, what we've been experiencing is a variety of experiences. And some of those are helpful and some of those are harmful. And sometimes they happen all at once. And, you know, that I think is the contradiction of this period that we're in. And it's also, I think, a more accurate way of looking at society nowadays. When I was doing my PhD research, I came across a word which you may never have seen before, but this was written by an 18th century poet called Robert Southey. The word is Ecological, and it literally means good and bad at the same time. Ecological. And I think for me, although I don't expect that to be on a t-shirt anytime soon, but as a frame of reference, I can see good and bad things happening all at once during this period of time. For players, for teams, I don't discount the possibility at all that some players, and I've heard some say it in interviews in the media, actually needed a break. They needed to be able to recharge their batteries, to refresh. So facing forward, I think what we're going to have to consider is how we manage risk. Now in sport, risk is one of those factors that we're aware of, we live with, and I've said that to people before and during this time. But I think we're navigating an uncertainty which is different from risk. Manage risk through your behavior, but the uncertainty is going to continue. And all I would say is that I think in our society in Ireland today, that it actually could serve us well to learn to cope better with anxiety, or not only anxiety, but uncertainty, to be able to manage uncertainty, to be able to see ourselves survive, overcome, perhaps even grow and develop amidst uncertainty. Because I think the outlook in our society maybe has to adapt or change a little bit more too. It's difficult to foresee how this uncertainty is likely to evaporate anytime soon. And I'm not preaching that as someone who's an expert in this field, far from it, but I've shared with you some data and information tonight. My question to you then is really inspired by both the model, the framework of an ecosystem, Bronfenbrenner's theory, but also the philosophy underpinning many Asian cultures, which is that they accept and accommodate themselves to the fact that good and bad can coexist. There can be light and darkness all at once. And I think for us, then the question that you might ask is, what can help with that? And I would like to suggest that actually developing a shared mental model and fostering a strong social identity can be extremely beneficial in helping people navigate their way through this. I would describe it as a compass amidst the chaos. If this chaos continues, or this uncertainty, if you choose that word, then ensuring that actually the values, attitudes, and beliefs that are espoused and embodied by you and shared and ingrained or embedded within your teams are ones which support, which help, which encourage, which give hope, which emphasize that actually we are all connected in this as human beings. And if we can get through this, as the Seamus Heaney quote used earlier this year said, if we can winter this, we can summer anywhere. And the truth is we're now in the summer and we're still learning to adapt to this. So I think one of the perspective shifts or mind shifts, which could be helpful, is to consider now, what are the values, attitudes, and beliefs which you think, you feel you bring to your team and which your team could develop, which would help them through this period of time and maybe beyond that into competition and the years ahead. So lastly, and I think it connects with this, is the way in which Phil Jackson as a coach helped to mould and shape the group of players whom he was with. You see there Scottie Pippen and Michael Jordan supporting one another, and there were, as you'll see if you read Phil Jackson's book, there were huge personalities, competing, maybe conflicting personalities within that team, but actually creating a sense, as Phil Jackson fostered, where there was a shared social identity, where there were shared beliefs and values, and those ebbed and flowed, but continually reinforcing and molding or reshaping those as they went through the various crises and experiences of loss, of separation, of conflict, to continue to come back to what is most important at the heart of the team, which is that we are all people connected together through sport. And in Jackson's own words, his way of describing a great team was what you see on the slide in front of you. A good team will become a great team when the players learn to trust each other enough to surrender the me for the we. And I would just add to that, that actually the me and the we go together. The I and the team are part of one unit, one ecosystem. And it's the balance, the harmony between those both that we have to strike, allowing for the experiences that all of us have gone through in this last period of time and may go through again, and ensuring that actually we're going through them together. Goramaigov.
Ciaran, thanks very much. A fascinating session. I suppose since we started talking about doing this session maybe a month or 6 weeks ago, I was very much looking forward to it, and it certainly lived up to all the expectations that I had. I'm especially delighted that we have looked at the psychosocial element of returning to play, because some of our previous sessions we've tried to look at different elements. We've tried to look at physical fitness elements and technical or skill elements or tactical elements and so on. And psychosocial is something that sometimes we neglect. And it's one of the reasons I was most pleased with the presentation that Fergal McGill gave a couple of weeks ago on the return to play, when he spoke about how we're pushing these things forward on a best endeavours basis. That we recognise this is for all of us to collectively try and do together, and that carrying that load in a social context would be really, really helpful for the whole community, as the whole community has responded, and GA clubs up and down the country and across the world have responded over the last number of weeks. One of the things that's interesting, and we have a couple of questions. One thing that's interesting for me is that coaches are very much entering a new phase now. As you said, we haven't experienced this before, and that can leave us very, very vulnerable. And I remember reading something last summer. Brian Cody mentioned in an interview that once once the ball is thrown in, he's as vulnerable on the sideline as any other coach. And I thought it was a really interesting thing because not many coaches accept or speak about that vulnerability. But what advice would you have for coaches that are feeling vulnerable?
Well, the first thing I would say is to be aware of it is the first step to acknowledging and addressing it. And vulnerability for me is actually a great quality in a coach. It's a sign of strength, not an indication of weakness. It's that idea, as I highlighted in the presentation, Peter, we're actually strong is not solid. The vulnerable and the strength go together. And I remember I've heard coaches talk about this, the ability to say, this isn't a great day for me. Things haven't gone well for me at home. The ability of a coach to connect with players, to show, actually, to humanize this. There's a word that was in my mind as I was thinking about this earlier. There's a lot of talk about sanitizing, and that's going to be important in a very functional way. Sanitizing equipment, sanitizing our hands. But we need to humanize it too. Coaches are people too. And I think that that is the starting point, that actually, as individuals, as people living through this, it is the most human of qualities to feel vulnerable at times. And I think the reassurance that we give to ourselves and to one another is, that doesn't mean you're in trouble. Being able to talk about that, to be aware of it, is actually a strong quality. I'd be very firmly of that view. And I think actually when you become, because vulnerability might be linked to thoughts or feelings, there are simple and certain techniques that you can use. You know, that it need not be associated with anxiety. It need not be connected to an experience of fear. But could we all, each of us, have experienced anxiety or fearfulness at some stage in this last period of time? Very definitely, I have. And I think it's simply a normal experience, reaction to the extraordinary circumstances that we've been in.
Absolutely, and I think coaches need to very much consider themselves at the moment. Like we've spent the last number of weeks learning to work in a new way, learning to cope with family and health issues in very, very strange times. And I suppose one of the things for me personally has been that while we very much cocooned ourselves at home, the issue of not being able to travel to visit family and friends has been the issue. Not necessarily that we didn't visit family and friends, because sometimes we can go a couple of weeks or a few even longer without speaking to friends and family. And now coaches might throw themselves headlong back into Gaelic games, which might not be the best thing necessary to do straight away. And they need to allow themselves to make those mistakes and to feel that vulnerability, as you said.
Well, I think that's right. The adaptations that we need to make with the same care as players make them, because there are relationships in family and community and clubs. That's why I think role clarity, being clear about expectations, that's all part of this period of time. And I know that there are coaches who may wonder, if I don't go back, am I letting the side down? And I think that's no one should be guilt tripped or burdening themselves in that way in this period of time. To actually get through this, to be able to survive and advance, is an accomplishment in itself. And to have done that in the style that people have done in Ireland, without in any way overlooking the tragedy that has also been experienced by many communities in this period. But I think that together with the volunteerism, which has come back to the fore, if someone at this stage in their career decided that actually the role I want to play is to continue to do that social good, to play that volunteering role, I would commend that. I would consider that to be a very important lesson that we've learned from this period, and not something substandard or secondary to playing or coaching.
We've had a number of questions come in from the audience this evening, and just wanted to maybe put a couple of them, if that's okay, for another 5 or so minutes. And there's been a number of similar ones, but we'll go with this one here. Sometimes children, especially the younger players, might be a little bit anxious about going back. The message over the last number of weeks has obviously been about, care and isolation and all of these things, and now we're going back into play and full contact reasonably quickly. So is there any simple techniques to help children who are feeling anxious about returning after being socially distant for so long?
Yeah, there are good materials which have been developed actually by the Psychology Society of Ireland, the British Ecological Society, and some of the youth groups. I know that there's a group Spun Out has a special text system, and I know that the GAA is doing a bit of work with Jigsaw. So as a start, I would signpost the coaches to go and read some more on this, and anybody who wants can email me, Peter, if they want particular advice on it. Specifically, I think understanding, and if you know these young people and children, you've coached with them before, is this a different experience? Are they manifesting something different to what they were before? And I learned some time ago from a fellow counsellor that sometimes children will not ask questions that they're afraid of the answers to. And that brings me back to the skill of communication, of listening, of careful questioning, of conversation. I think conversations with parents, conversations with the children or young people themselves, actually, in my world, they take even more importance now over how many hours or minutes of football or hurling they get. The opportunity to hear their views, their experience, what they've been through, and framing questions in a way which makes sense, that are soft questions, but nonetheless able to allow you to see what the child is thinking or feeling. And sometimes it's behavioral patterns. It's maybe someone who is hasn't been sleeping well, or they haven't been turning up at training, and these are experiences that we've had before. I know that some research has been done on maybe with children off school and at home, that parents have seen more anxiety, more agitation, maybe some more tantrums within a particular age group. I think it's about 4 to 11. Some of the research suggests that, whereas adolescents, there hasn't been the same issues presenting in that research. But ultimately, don't go by research, go by the people in front of you, get to their level, and use your good coaching skills, because if these are children or young people whom you've had contact with before, you already have a frame of reference for how they best communicate and the circumstances around them at home.
And there's been a few questions. I think I get the sort of bona fides of the question about people maybe whose motivation has dipped a little bit, and how to reignite that motivation. Again, as a coach, if that motivation has dipped, what advice you would give? But also, if a coach is coaching a group of players and they notice that some players are no longer motivated, is there something there that can be looked at?
Yeah, look, I think in this period of time, as coaches come back in contact with their players, and you may have had contact during this time by Zoom meetings or phone calls, I'm not sure, but I think you'll know the individual better than someone like me sitting further afield. And find out, ask. I think it's actually a very normal thing for motivation in this period to ebb and flow, as I said in the presentation. I know of players who maybe question themselves too much if they haven't been able to get to a training session, or things haven't gone well at the training session they did that didn't go right for them. I think it's actually about encouraging them just to see that if you do anything, you know what? One example would be a very practical example. Say this coming week, for a player to set goals based on what they've done last week. So if you've done 2 or 3 sessions last week, were they good quality sessions? Did you do half an hour? Can you do 40 minutes? If it's something where a player has a particular role in the team, is there something that they can work on that they really enjoy doing? Sometimes motivation at this time subsides because the joy, the energy levels have changed. I can think of one player who felt actually his energy levels were not so high because he wasn't eating right. He wasn't getting advice about nutrition. And that, energy in, energy out phenomenon or formula is a very simple one. But in terms of sustaining motivation, ultimately, and you saw that in Ciaran Lusty and Jerry Fitzgerald's model, the self-determination model, the strongest type of motivation will be that which is internal, intrinsic. Now, in this period of time, I actually think players have found out something about their own motivation, what motivates them. And maybe it's you as a coach finding out a bit more about that. How did you motivate yourself during this time? And what maybe they learn from other teammates? Is there something to do with the team, the identity and the values of the team that connects to the player and gives that player the added impetus to continue with training or maybe up their game? And I've actually noticed, Peter, that in the last period of time, as the transition begins and the roadmap was published, that actually some of those concerns about motivation that people had during lockdown, they've begun to recede. There's a renewed focus, a sense of the horizon is in front of us, and people feel then a greater sense of vigor about what they want to do. They want to be ready. But psychological readiness includes ensuring that you have an appetite for this. And if somebody doesn't, if they just don't feel up for it at the moment, remember, opting in is a better approach than saying they have to opt out.
I think that's a perfect way to finish up the session. Ciaran, thank you very much on behalf of everyone here today, over 380 or so people. It's been a fantastic session, and actually it brings the conclusion of the live sessions that we have as part of this series. So over the last 14 weeks, we've had 27 separate sessions. Some of those were Q&As with coaches. Some of those were webinars presented by coaches and coach developers. Over those 14 weeks, we had in excess of 19,000 live participants. At the same time, we'd almost 40,000 views on YouTube. So for anybody who wants to view any of the previous sessions that we've had, you can go to YouTube and just type in GA Learning, and you'll find the GA Learning YouTube channel, and you can see many of the presentations are already up, and some are being edited and put up as we speak. I want to say sincere thanks to each and every one of our speakers. Over the 27 sessions, we've had 34 separate speakers, and each of them has put in a huge effort in developing the presentation and in getting their materials in exactly as they wanted it, and we're really grateful for that. I'm also really grateful that each of the speakers that we asked, not one of them said no. Each and every one of them saw the value in what we were trying to do and put the shoulder to the wheel. We've had to schedule some sessions at strange times. Julia Walsh in Australia, we recorded that at 5 o'clock in the morning, which was a bit strange. And others we've had live, and others we could have went on for half the night with some of those sessions. So personally, thanks very much to all of our speakers. Thanks very much to each of the individuals who attended our sessions. There's also a few people in the background maybe that as always, people might not have seen or that might not have seen or might not have heard of being involved. So Sean O'Brien from Patrick's Well in Limerick is working with us at the moment as an intern, and Sean is the one who's editing and uploading all the videos to YouTube. And as I was explaining to Ciaran before we started, Sean had to teach himself how to edit video to do this. So very well done to Sean. Equally, Katie Nagasaki, despite what you might think, is from Donegal and a Gaelbor, and she has put in a tremendous effort on all the social media elements of this over the last number of weeks. So thanks to both Sean and Kaylee. For all the people on the call this evening, while this is the last of the live sessions we're going to have, what we're going to do is we're going to come back later on in the autumn, in around late September, and we're putting together some plans for an 8-week series of webinars again. At this stage, it's likely that they will be live because we'll be in the middle of club competitions and club championships and so on. But what we'll do is we'll advertise those sessions and we'll have them recorded, and we'll play all those sessions on YouTube, and they'll be available for everyone to see. As I said, we've had almost 40,000 people engage with the sessions on YouTube right now. So if you wanted to go to the GA Learning webpage, you'll find all the details of all the presentations that speakers have had, slides and resource documents and so on, all the way back from Claudia Butler and Brendan Harper back in late March, straight up to Ciaran's presentation this evening. Each and every one of them are up there right now. As I said, go to the GA Learning YouTube channel for so many of the videos that are already in place. So all that's left for me to say is thanks to everyone again. Now that our pitches are open, I'd encourage you to watch back over some of the previous sessions we've had, especially some of the ones maybe that might be topical about coming back to play in the next couple of weeks as regards injury and fitness and some of the psychosocial stuff that Ciaran spoke about this evening. So thanks again to all the people who've taken the time to come and be with us every Tuesday and Thursday over the last 14 weeks. It's certainly been a privilege to be involved with so many fantastic speakers. And I know that as a coach myself, I've learned so much from all of these people. So thanks very much to everyone, and we wish you well on your coaching endeavours for the rest of the season. And hopefully we'll see you all again back here in around late September for some more learning and interesting sessions. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.